My name's Gene Sessions. I teach at Weber State. I've been there 45 years, and I keep getting asked more and more often lately, when are you retiring? I think it's my look that's getting me in trouble. Anyway, we're not going to waste any time. We've got two really amazing presentations today. I did not know Scott before just a few minutes ago. We've been corresponding back and forth, but I'm impressed so much, and I'll talk more about that later. Ken I've known since he was in diapers. His dad taught me geography in 9th grade, and so I've got a lot on Ken. But not to waste any more of our time with that sort of talk, let me introduce them to you briefly. We'll introduce both of them, and then the format is, if you don't know, we'll then hear their papers. I have a brief commentary, Steve, and then we'll have time for questions. So that's kind of how we'll go. Scott Thomas is an independent historian who graduated from Brigham Young University, where he obtained his bachelor and master's degrees in history. His master's thesis was awarded the Lester E. Bush Award, and his most recent publication deals with the anti-war movement in Utah during the Vietnam War years and can be found in the Utah Historical Quarterly. Kenneth L. Alford is currently a professor of church history and doctrine at Brigham Young University. Prior to arriving at BYU, he served as a professor of computer science at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Colonel Alford. And as a professor and department chair of strategic leadership at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. After almost 30 years of active military service and a wide variety of assignments, Ken retired in 2008 as a U.S. Army colonel. Scott, you're on.
All right. Well, before I begin, just let me say real quick how much I want to say thank you and sorry to Professor Sessions all at once. He agreed to read a much longer version of this paper to help me out, and I really appreciate it. And I apologize because we were going back and forth, and he was giving me comments as early as this morning, so super helpful. So, 3 years after settling in the Salt Lake Valley, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints boasted that their law-abiding citizenry was unlike any other because it did not require extra legal methods to maintain control. Locals echoed this sentiment for nearly 2 decades and credited the territory's legal and social structure with deterring the organization of vigilance committees in the region. When chaos seemed to be a daily issue in many Western settlements, Latter-day Saints took pride in what they considered an ordered and stable society. Making such a claim during a time when retributive justice was reaching its apex in many Western locales is certainly bold, if not suspect. Utah did not have organized vigilance committees like many Western neighbors. This was unique because the Latter-day Saints had relied on the Danites for protection prior to moving west. Danites functioned very much like a vigilance committee within the community of saints. Although the organization did not move west with the church, many former Danites did. Though disbanded, the tradition and habits of the famed defenders of the Latter-day Saint people would prove to be hard to kill. For the first time in their history, the church did not create, fund, and direct vigilante activities as they had done in Missouri and Nauvoo. Many researchers and writers are nearly unanimous in their assertion that the root cause of violence in territorial Utah was the direct result of religious zealotry, not rough justice. Although episodes of bloodshed in territorial Utah have been routinely viewed as the consequence of Mormon fanaticism, the evidence suggests that a large amount, arguably the majority of day-to-day violence, is more properly cataloged within the context of Western vigilantism. Like their Western neighbors, Utahns did employ extra legal means for maintaining the existing social structure, regardless of what they had claimed. Crime was not taken lightly by Utah residents. It was understood by travelers and residents alike that crime, even petty theft, was not tolerated within the territory. Repeat offenders found that the more one continued to disobey, the more likely one was to disappear. Caution and warning became the articles of faith for church members, especially in their commercial dealings with outsiders. As noted by historian Gene Sessions, quote, "The saints in the Great Basin Kingdom now lived in constant fear, never doubting that any sign of weakness on their part would bring violent purges and death at the hands of their enemies, whom they perceived to be nearly everyone outside the bounds of the church, end quote. Utah crafted unique laws to deal with seduction and rape, and the existence of polygamy only made matters even more complicated for outsiders. John Vaughn and Newton Brassfield lost their lives due to this fact. The former was gunned down following Sunday services. The latter, while being escorted by a U.S. Marshal, quote, on one of the principal streets of Salt Lake City that, according to witnesses, was thronged with people. Outsiders accused Utahns of uncontrollable violence. Brigham Young derided such claims as an unacceptable double standard. If Latter-day Saints were afforded the same leeway as their neighbors, he said, the violence, quote, would scarcely be noticed at all. Unsurprisingly, the famed William Bill Hickman, also known as Brigham Young's destroying angel, was involved in several incidents of violence in the Utah Territory. He'd have to with that name. Many believed Hickman to be the leader of the Utah Danites, the church's equivalent of a major vigilance committee. As one observer pointed out in 1856, the Danites originally organized as a species of secret police to execute the behests of the church by whom suspected persons can be dealt with and, if need be, put off out of the way and are still in existence, according to this observer. In a compilation of grievances submitted to the United States Congress, over 50 immigrants that had direct contact with Latter-day Saints in Utah alleged the Danites were utilized both inside and outside the territorial boundaries to, quote, perpetrate their foul and fiendish purposes. According to these affidavits, the lifeguards were dispatched their victims by, quote, sinking them in lakes, cutting off their heads, or slitting their throats. Lore regarding Danite crimes and dealings was abundant during the territorial period. The legendary band of mercenaries became a favorite of contemporary novelists whose tales depicted these destroying angels as ruthless and capable assassins who stalked victims and dispatched them in the most horrific ways imaginable. Many believed that the organization was fully operational. It was not uncommon for mysterious murders, assaults, and other mischievous dealings to be blamed on the infamous Danites. They were an easy target. There were many prominent men throughout the valley who had served as Danite troops in Missouri and Illinois. The previous association led many observers to incorrectly assume that, as with membership in the church itself, once a Danite, always a Danite. Contemporaries regularly denied the existence of the band in the Utah Territory. When asked by historian Hubert Howe Bancroft if the Danites existed in Utah, President John Taylor retorted, I have no confidence in the statement about the Danites. This position was defended by the destroying angel himself, who in a conversation with an immigrant unequivocally stated, quote, that there never was any organization of the kind in this country. Former Missouri Danite and self-taught Utah lawyer Hosea Stout prosecuted many cases dealing with lawlessness in the area. One claim brought to the court excited and alarmed many travelers. An H.B. Taylor, a known member of the Latter-day Saint faith, was a road agent accused of plotting to, quote, rob, plunder, and kill certain immigrants. During the proceedings, it became clear that such activities were, quote, very common, and that many worked as highwaymen whose business it was to, quote, kill strangers and take their cattle and property, and many other such things. The shock that one of their own was involved in such actions devastated many Latter-day Saints and raised more questions for residents about who could be trusted. Taylor did confess and was immediately cut off from the church. It was a precarious time for the leaders of the church. The financial investment to gather members to modern-day Zion was proving to be an extremely costly endeavor. After establishing the Perpetual Immigration Fund, the debt grew to a staggering amount, and as more immigrants leveraged the fund than ever before in 1855. Those accused of joining the church only to take advantage of the sacred funds were labeled apostates and treated with the utmost derision by the leadership and laity, who felt that they were responsible for spreading false rumors that garnered unwarranted attention and ire from government officials. President Young and his counselors would increase the volume and sharpen their tone against those leaving the church and took preventative measures to dissuade others from reneging on their faith. It was during this tense time that the church leaders began openly preaching the contours of the enigmatic doctrine of blood atonement. The teaching circulated unofficially for years. However, the onset of the Mormon Reformation released the credo for public scrutiny. This marks an important shift in the paradigm that is early Utah history. Prominent among the misunderstood religious teachings of the church, blood atonement advanced the notion that forgiveness for certain crimes required the blood of the sinner to be shed in order for true repentance to be achieved. With its emergence during the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri and renewed notoriety just before the 1857 and 1858 Utah War, blood atonement confounded contemporaries as much as it continues to muddle modern scholars and historians. Many have directly tied the teaching to many violent encounters. In fact, not long after establishing residency in the West, the popular press attributed, quote, almost every murder in the Utah Territory to blood atonement, a notion that many modern scholars have reinforced. The fallacy that blood atonement was connected to the majority of violent acts in Utah is based primarily on a misunderstanding of the Latter-day Saints in general and how they fit inside the contours of the American West. This teaching, along with the complicated and tragic bloodshed at Mountain Meadows, has cast an unnecessarily long shadow over the history and interpretation of violence in Utah and within the church. In a very real sense, the existence of blood atonement has allowed for a loose historical understanding of complicated and nuanced events that, when properly explored, are tenuous at best. The teaching was not intended for those outside the faith. Founded in scriptures from the Bible, the saints were taught to live in strict obedience to God's commands and avert the penalties associated with certain sins, primarily murder. During the Reformation, leaders pushed members toward a recommittal to the faith to forsake their wrongs and begin anew. The flames of the Reformation flickered away and died out in late 1857, but accusations of blood atonement as a central theme among Utah's religious community had just begun. The impact was visible in the various governmental investigations, accounts from disaffected individuals, and editorials throughout the region. Its reputation garnered favor over the years and remains a cornerstone of Utah violence studies to this day. By 1860, the landscape in Utah had changed dramatically with a massive influx of outsiders making their home among adherents to the faith. Miners, railroad workers, and army camp followers had taken up residence amidst the ascendant religious populace. The shift in the social environment disquieted some, and as the dominant newspaper attested, violence increased. By now, it had become so commonplace in Utah that, quote, such occurrences do not seemingly attract much attention, particularly when the murdered have had the reputation of being thieves and murderers or of associating with such characters, end quote. Shootings were becoming the order of the day. Armed citizens added a volatile element to the already tense situation between warring crime syndicates operating within the Salt Lake City limits. Salt Lake City had become a flashpoint for conflict among cattle rustling gangs, spreading unease and violence. Officials had attempted to maintain order in Salt Lake, but to little avail. A 400% increase in the police force had minimal impact on controlling the violent ruptures throughout the municipality. The heart of Zion was so constantly embroiled with brawls, crime, thievery, and hostility that Apostle George A. Smith called it the headquarters of rowdyism. During this time, residents of Utah County were trying to figure out how to handle one Isaac Ike Potter, not to be confused with the Parish Potter murders. This is a different murder. Residents of the of Ike Potter and his mixed band of outlaws. For years, Ike and his posse had profited from their banditry and terrorizing of the settlers and travelers in the southern regions. Although Potter had been the recipient of a traditional Latter-day Saint upbringing in Idaho, he had disassociated himself from the church and indulged in a life of crime. Thomas Barney rode with Potter for a few years, but then decided to change his ways and leave behind the lawless lifestyle. 3 months later, Barney sat at home rocking his baby when a shotgun slid through the nearby window and took aim at the unsuspecting father. The first shot tore the side of Barney's face and neck apart, propelling him to the ground. The second blast ripped his back open. Luckily, his body protected the young child who lay under the bloodied corpse. With the dying breast, Barney identified Ike Potter and members of his former gang as the ones responsible for the shooting. By March, it looked like Ike's days as a public nuisance were about to end. However, after 3 days of questioning from the jury, after being arrested for larceny, the jury found Potter, quote, not guilty. The evidence was ruled circumstantial and Potter walked away scot-free. A jury in Springville had let Ike slip away, but vigilantes to the north were not as forgiving. 4 years passed, and the Utah desperado found himself once again in the hands of the law. He and two friends, Charles Wilson and John Walker, were suspected of theft. The three were utterly taken by surprise when a group of armed men appeared at the schoolhouse where the alleged criminals were being temporarily held before being transported to the courthouse. It was nearly midnight, a strange hour to be escorted from their temporary cells. Each of the captives recognized their escorts as members of the Vigilant Committee, not the normal guards, and understood the march into the darkness as a concealment for extrajudicial proceedings. The prisoners understood that death was stalking them, and they decided to bolt. Before Potter could get far, he was shot and died instantly. Wilson was more fortunate in his flight, but he too eventually was chased down and killed. The only survivor was 19-year-old Walker, who escaped with gunshot wounds to his hand, wrist, and chest. Walker managed to elude his captors and sought refuge at a nearby army outpost where he provided the identity of 8 of the vigilantes. Judge John Titus ordered the accused to the penitentiary until trial. However, none served time in jail or even appeared before a court to answer for their actions. Soon thereafter, Walker also disappeared and was never heard from again. Probably the Danites. As gruesome as the actions were, people of Utah County did not lament the vigilante justice that had been dealt to the known scoundrels. The official organ of the church reminded readers that the vigilante justice was warranted due in part to the calamitous relationship with the federal government that, quote, constantly release upon us criminals, thieves, and murderers, forcing the citizenry to protect ourselves and administer summary punishment, end quote. Judges such as Judge Titus had a bullish time in the Utah Territory. When federally appointed Governor John Dawson discovered himself at odds with the citizens, he hired known thugs as bodyguards to guarantee his safety as he fled from the territory after less than a month in office. On the edge of town, his guards betrayed him and beat him severely. According to Bill Hickman, himself not involved in the matter, one of the roughs, Jason Luce, claimed he and others were sent by the police captain to go, quote, give the governor a good beating, end of quote. Denounced by Brigham Young, 3 of the culprits stole a horse and skipped town. A mix of official representatives and vigilantes set out after the offenders and cornered them on the outskirts of town. Among the group was Orrin Porter Rockwell, who cradled a .44 revolver as he approached the bandit, Lot Huntington. Both men were known to be quick on the draw, and as Huntington took aim, Old Port raised his gun, and before the notorious horse thief's body hit the ground, it had been pumped with 8 successive rounds in the gut. 2 of Huntington's cronies, Moroni Clausen and John P. Smith, quickly surrendered to the legendary gunslinger, who had boasted that he had, quote, never killed anyone who didn't need killing, end of quote. These prisoners would not live long enough to plead their case to a judge or jury. No sooner had the crooks been handed over to local law enforcement than 2 shots rang out in the night. Apparently, as they were being escorted to the jailhouse, they were gunned down while trying to escape. After inspecting the corpses, Bill Hickman concluded that the fatal wounds did not match the testimony of the escorts, as both victims were, quote, powder burnt and one of them shot in the face, end of quote. Brigham Young commended those involved in the shooting for the willingness and bravery in ridding the territory of unwanted criminals. He then thanked, quote, God that our officers will not suffer themselves to be shot down by notorious scoundrels who disrupt the dealings of the honest citizens of Utah, end of quote. As for those criminals who refused to reform, Young encouraged them to attempt to resist the law so that they could be summarily dealt with. A practice that, according to one critic, had earned the reputation that all of the local police obediently, sorry, I lost my place there. According to one critic, the police had, quote, earned the reputation of affording every desperate prisoner the opportunity of escape, so that extra-legal action could be taken within legal boundaries. Residents were encouraged to be heavy-handed with dealing with robbers. President Young supported catching them dead or alive so as to deter such activities from gaining foothold in his territory. The dominant people in Utah were exercising their frontier right to protect themselves, their land, and the people by any means necessary. Their actions, as many of the examples have shown, were not always civil or kind. They were effectively frontier. 2 examples of the summary punishment of thieves illustrate this point. When the citizens of Cache County captured a known horse thief, they had no jail and utilized his local schoolhouse in Logan to confine him. Early in the morning, the prisoner tried to escape. Quote, but met with a detainer in the form of 9 rifle balls. About the same time, an immigrant had his horse stolen by an A.B. Baker, the notorious highwayman. Rather than inform the local police, he and an acquaintance set off after the thief. They caught up with Baker in Echo Canyon, and the immigrant shot Baker in the thigh. He fled for his life and tried to bargain with his captors by offering to disclose the location where more than 1,000 stolen horses were located. The newspaper summed up the execution. Quote, "He was buried by those who thus meted out to him summary justice, not exactly according to law, but upon a more speedy, economical, and salutary principle, and a stake placed at the head of his grave on which it was inscribed, A.B. Baker, shot for horse stealing, July 1st, 1860. Like robbery, land jumping was a terrible offense and often led to violent showdowns. John Geen had joined the church prior to coming to Utah. In 1848, he had killed a fellow Mormon for trespassing on his property in Iowa. After destroying his fence line for the 3rd time, an angry neighbor returned with some friends to strong-arm Geen into giving up some of his land. The group circled Geen, who pulled his pistol and shot Condon immediately. The mob rushed upon Geen and pell-mell beat him until they thought he was dead. Nearly a decade later, Geen sued the 7 men who had accosted him, and in true frontier justice was fully exonerated of the murder and awarded $1,500 in damages. The year after the lawsuit, Geen was found dead on the streets of Salt Lake City with a gunshot wound that entered through his forehead and shattered the back of his skull. Although his death was officially logged as a, quote, suicide, there was much evidence to the contrary. Dr. J. King Robinson met a similar fate. However, the vigilantes were more devious in their approach. A doctor working at Camp Douglas, Robinson lived on the margins of the Latter-day Saint Society both physically and metaphorically. Claiming some unsettled land outside the occupied limits of Salt Lake City, Robinson constructed a small shanty to claim the land and demonstrate ownership, a common practice at the time. A group of ruffians vandalized Robinson's shanty, threatened him, and warned him to desist from building on the property. The doctor refused to remit his claim, sought legal counsel, and brought a claim against the vandals in the 3rd District Court. To his surprise, the defendants disclaimed all interest in the land and declined to be involved in the proceedings. A few days later, Robinson was coaxed out of his home in the midnight hours by some men claiming that their friend needed medical attention. The doctor reluctantly acquiesced and hurried into the streets on what would be his last medical call. Once out of the home, the roughs shot and stabbed the doctor and left him for dead. Outsiders believed that the doctor was killed for his land and his bravado in bringing a lawsuit against locals. Church members laid the blame at the feet of the transient population whose desperate character and dubious acts led them to perpetrate countless crimes in the territory. Setting aside religious differences, citizens of all stripes raised funds to be granted for the capture of the murderers, but the perpetrators were never apprehended. Such extrajudicial proceedings happened here as everywhere else, claimed the Deseret News. Driven by expediency, quote, hot blood sometimes is too hasty for the slow steps of law, and a wrong is attempted to be right by violence. The dual system of religious and civil law, while at times at odds with one another, did provide a rigid moral code. A one-time visitor to the Utah Territory admired the rigorous system of conduct that directed many Latter-day Saints. Quote, not that Mormons ever pretend there are no bad men among them. Nay, agreeably to their principles, they will tell you that a Mormon, if bad, will be worse than other men, because he sins against greater light and knowledge. And after receiving the Spirit of God, but taking the people all around, I consider them as moral, industrious, fair-dealing, and hospitable a set as one is apt to fall in with. End of quote. Some may agree with a different assessment from Judge Cradlebaugh, whose harangue that all Latter-day Saints were, quote, the tools, the dupes, the instruments of a tyrannical church despotism, end of quote. There is no nuance or context to be determined. Rather, the historical Latter-day Saints were, in his opinion, taught to obey their orders and commit horrid murders. Further, they lacked liberty and had become the willing instruments of bad men. The vantage requires little thought, effort, or depth. Individuals made dastardly decisions. This is true, but these were their decisions. Men and women took action to protect the contours of their space as they saw fit. Early Latter-day Saints deserve a more nuanced and balanced approach. Their humanity, accomplishments, along with their failures and missteps, demand scholarly rigor. Their distrust and fear cannot be underestimated. But it dissipated as the church positioned itself as a legitimate member of a cohort of states in union with one another. The new alliance did not settle the score for many, but it did have a lasting effect on the church and individuals alike. Vigilantism existed in territorial Utah, but uniquely without the standard vigilance committees. The citizens engaged in extra-legal violence to monitor and maintain their society. Blood Atonement and Mountain Meadows loomed large as flashpoints, deserving of attention and concern and investigation. However, Blood Atonement was not involved in the majority of violence in the Utah Territory. Latter-day Saints were not servants to an almighty prophet, nor were they simply pious farmers who ate, prayed, and prayed some more. They were Westerners forging their way toward an understanding of themselves, recognizing they no longer could allow the shadows of the past to haunt them in their present state. Thank you.
Let's turn to the Civil War for a few minutes. The traditional story for Utah in the Civil War is that Utah sat out the Civil War, and that's been propagated by several historians. But the more I've looked into this, it was anything but. You can't have an event like the Civil War and sit it out. So let's just look at a couple of things. Let me show you first. These are the faces of Utahns that fought in the Civil War. Of course, they're much older than they were when they fought, but just some really interesting folks. This guy, let's see if I've got a laser here. I don't. This guy right here, Mayor of Ogden, when he died, he was a Confederate. His name is Peary. That's where Peary's Egyptian Theater is from. He's the Peary. And when he died, the Deseret News ran an entire front page article on him. And it started with, David Peary, although a Confederate, still a good guy. The guy right next to him, he was born as William Norman. He spent 70 of his 90 years, though, as John E. Davis. He was a galvanized Yankee. He was from Georgia and got caught. And then to get out of prison in Illinois, he joined the Union Army thinking he would escape, but they sent him out to Utah. And so the trick was on him. He put the trick back on the Union Army and escaped, and then changed his name. He never told his wife his real name. He joined the Latter-day Saint Church. He was baptized, called out of mission, endowed, sealed in the temple under the wrong name. So there's just a bunch of characters here. Some really interesting folks. Lots of stories to be told, but we'll look at something different today. When the Civil War breaks out, we traditionally think it starts at Fort Sumter, and it does. It starts in that area. The first shots formally fired, because there's shots fired back, are on April 12th, 1861. What a lot of people don't recognize, though, is the first shots fired in anger are actually on January 9th, 1861. And they're fired on a supply ship that is coming to supply Fort Sumter. The Confederates fire on the ship. The reason that's not started as the count of the Civil War, or the start of the Civil War, is because the Union forces don't fire back. But the ship that comes to supply them is called Star of the West. And this is just a quick aside. Star of the West is a merchant ship that carries Utah's mail in the years before the war. And so many Deseret News articles say, we've received our Star of the West shipment, and they're at the following post offices in Utah. You can pick up your letters. And so Utah kind of weaves in a little bit as well. Well, what I want to do today is talk about some things that you may not have heard of. I think they're just kind of fun stories from the Civil War that just don't get a lot of press. So let's look at a couple of these. First, you would think that Utah, as a pro-Union territory, you would think it's going to get fairly good press across the nation. You would be wrong. And so what I want to do is just take just a couple of minutes and look at how Utah was treated in the popular press by giving you a couple of examples. This is from April 4th, 1860. So this gives you a little bit of feel before the war. Okay, so we're 8 months away from South Carolina seceding, and we're 1 year away from shots being fired at Fort Sumter. Now you have to remember that the newly formed Republican Party in 1856 that runs John C. Fremont as their first candidate for president, they have a dual platform. And it's to stop the twin pillars of barbarism. And the first pillar is slavery, and the second pillar is polygamy. Okay? So this article appears in the New York Times. A temporizing policy towards, and I've got a blank there, can never be reproductive of any good. And so my question to you is, in 1860, is it a temporizing policy towards South Carolina, or is it a temporizing policy towards the Mormons? And I will tell you that New York Times says it's towards the Mormons. They're excusing South Carolina's increasingly radical behavior, arguing about the upcoming election, and they're focusing on polygamy at the time. This is an article from the Chicago Tribune. This is like 2 weeks before South Carolina secedes. So Lincoln has been elected. Everybody can see this train wreck coming. And here's the way the Chicago Tribune reports it. A conspiracy to dissolve the Union has existed in South Carolina for 32 years. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina is the author of the scheme. Now look what they do next. He is the Joe Smith of slaveholding Mormonism. Okay, they put even the rebellion in South Carolina in terms of polygamy. Okay, South Carolina is the Utah of this relic of barbarism. That's how bad South Carolina is. They're Utah. Okay, one of the twins, the twin pillars of barbarism, or twin relics of barbarism, one of the twins has its headquarters in Charleston and the other is in Salt Lake City. These are linked numerous times. I did a separate study for a paper I gave in South Carolina. And there's dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of newspaper articles throughout the war linking us to South Carolina. The fact that Utah is remaining pro-Union just gets ignored. Okay, I'm going to give you another one. This is in May, just after the army in Utah is told to leave the territory and head back east so they can join the fight. This is printed in the New York Times. Quote, the removal of the small force from Utah will prove a fatal blunder as it will leave the great overland routes to California and Oregon unprotected and invite aggression. Okay, so far so good. Look how the author finishes the sentence. Both from lawless Mormons and hostile Indians. Okay? There are other reports in the New York Times that says that Brigham Young has a massive spy network and he is controlling 50,000 Indians doing his bidding. There's probably not 50,000 Indians to control, but Brigham's got them all, apparently. Let me give you another article. This is from the Daily Morning News out of Savannah, Georgia, so deep in the heart of Confederate land. This is the second year of the war. Quote, we hope Father Brigham, of course, Brigham Young, we hope Father Brigham will give the Yankees as much trouble as possible. Well, you can see that sentiment, but now look at this next statement. And remember, this is from a Southern newspaper in the height of the war. They, the North, are no better than the Mormons, though they, the North, conceal their rascality a little more. Good heavens.
So who did we favor?
Utah remained pro-Union. In fact, the first telegram that's sent, once the wires reach Salt Lake, and they reach us 2 different weeks in October. They come from the east first. Brigham Young sends a famous telegram, and everybody thinks it's sent to Lincoln. It's not. It's sent to H. Wade, who's the president of the telegraph company. But it begins, Utah has not seceded it. Okay, that's the way it begins. The second thing that I've discovered, and I'm working on either a really long article or a fairly short book, and I haven't quite decided yet, but there's a really interesting officer mutiny that occurs at Fort Crittenden. Now, just by way of explanation, Fort Crittenden, what happens is when the Utah Army comes out with Johnston, what we popularly refer to as Johnston's Army, the Army never calls it that, it's the Utah Expedition, but what we call here in Utah Johnston's Army, they settle at Camp Floyd, okay? And Floyd is John B. Floyd, Secretary of War. You'd think it's pretty safe to name a camp after the Secretary of War. Well, John B. Floyd defects to the Confederacy, becomes a brigadier for the Confederacy. And so it's like, no, we can't have this big fort out in Utah named after a Confederate general. So they rename it after a senator from Kentucky because they're trying to keep Kentucky in the Union. Senator Crittenden gets this fort named after him, so they change it from a camp to a fort. But what happens is it's commanded by this guy. This is Phillips and George Cook. Now, Phillips and George Cook has a history with Latter-day Saints. He takes over after Allen dies, and he goes with the Mormon battalion clear to San Diego. And so he knows and has great respect for Latter-day Saints and Latter-day Saints soldiers. He is commanding as a colonel the fort at Fort Crittenden. He oversees the renaming and all of that. What happens, though, is the army is then ordered to leave the territory because they're needed back east, because one of the largest concentration of U.S. troops is in Utah because of the Utah War. So they're ordering them back. He's got a command at that time of about 600. It's down from about 1,500 at the height. But he's ordered to return, to take his forces. They prepare to leave. This is in the spring of 1861. What happens is 3 folks on his staff, his paymaster, a guy by the name of Hunt, his surgeon, a guy by the name of Porter, and his quartermaster, a guy by the name of Clary. Okay, so we've got a couple of majors and a captain here. These are on his staff at Fort Crittenden, and they write to, kind of hard to read here, but they write to S. Cameron. S. Cameron is Simon Cameron. He happens to be the Secretary of War who takes over from John Floyd. Okay, and he's right before Edward M. Stanton, who serves as Lincoln's Secretary of War. But they write to Secretary Cameron, and they basically say, hey, you got to help us out here. Our commander is a Confederate treasonous officer, and he's going to undermine and sabotage bringing the army back. Our guy, if I could have you hold questions till the end, that'd be awesome. But you got to just watch this guy. He's traitorous. And so they write to the Secretary of War. Now, they haven't mentioned it to their boss, okay? And so what happens is at Fort Crittenden, a little war starts because the officer corps divides those that support these 3 guys and those that support the commander. One of the guys, John Gibbon, who later gains fame in the Battle of Gettysburg, he also gains fame with other military experiences, but he's a captain in the 4th Artillery, and he writes to the Secretary of War and says, look, these guys are nuts. There's not a more loyal officer in the army. Well, what kind of complicates it is that Philip St. George Cook has a daughter, and his daughter falls in love with a very dashing young man by the name of Jeb Stuart. So Philip St. George Cook's son-in-law is Jeb Stuart, who's going to be the scourge of the Union cavalry. Okay, Jeb louses up really royally at Gettysburg, but that's in the future. Okay, and Philip St. George Cook is from Virginia. What happens is they receive in Utah a copy of this newspaper article, and the way they've set the podium, some of you can't see it, so I'll tell you, down the very bottom, this is from the Richmond Whig. The Richmond Whig publishes an article saying, we have made appointments into the Army of the Confederacy of the following officers, and included in that list is Philip St. George Cook, Brigadier General of Volunteers. And so Hunt, Clary, and Porter say, ta-da-da-da-da, we now got proof from a Confederate source our boss is a traitor. And they then write to the Secretary of War again. Okay? Well, I tracked down these articles. And this article is published in northern and southern newspapers all over the country. And the earliest copies of the article we can find, that's not an O. It's a C. And then some poor typesetter, they used to use 12 and 13-year-old kids as typesetters. He probably pulls the letter out of the lowercase drawer and grabs an O instead of a C, thinking, oh, I know what Cook is. Cock, that's a weird name, so it's probably Cook. And it's a copy of the change that reaches Utah. So what I want to point out is this is Philip St. George Cook. He's from Virginia. He's a graduate of West Point, class of 1827, and he is the United States Army officer. This gentleman is Philip St. George Cock, from Virginia, graduate of the United States Military Academy in 1832, Confederate forces. What's the odds? I mean, this is not like John Jones, okay, or Joe Smith. This is Philip St. George Cook. And they both went to West Point, and they're both from Virginia, and one letter in that newspaper article sends those 3 guys at Fort Crittenden off gallivanting on this treasonous story. The bottom line is Cook is exonerated. He writes the most wonderful letter to the Secretary of War, espousing his allegiance to the nation. It's a beautiful, beautiful letter. And he becomes a major general in the Union Army. Crook becomes a brigadier general of the Confederate forces and puts a bullet through his head in a suicide 1 year later. Okay? But I just think that is so weird. 2 Philip St. George Cooks, basically. Okay? Well, let's look at another one. Did you know that there were constitutional designs for a Utah Navy? Okay, Utah was going to have, if we come into the Union, we are going to have a Navy. We're going to contribute all we can. Here's the statement out of the Utah Constitution that was proposed during the war. The governor shall be the commander-in-chief of naval and military forces of this state. Boom. Hoo-ha. Okay, we're going to have our own Navy. I just think that's hilarious. I guess it's going to be on the Jordan River and the Great Salt Lake. Okay? So, did you also know, here's a 4th item, we held a state election in the territory of Utah 34 years before we were granted statehood. Our delegate to Congress during much of the Civil War was a guy by the name of William Hooper. And Hooper's famous statement is, we're trying to get into the Union while everybody else is trying to get out. And we had appealed for statehood since 1849 with the state of Deseret. We made appeals during the 1850s. We make appeals during the 1860s as well. They just unfortunately go nowhere, okay? But what we do is, you'll remember, Scott mentioned that in 1862, Dawson, when he went out, he talked about him getting beat up. Dawson leaves on New Year's Eve, and that leaves Utah with no governor in residence, only an acting governor. So the Utah Territory leaps on that fact, and on January 6th declares a territory-wide election to elect delegates to become a state. The thinking is, if Congress won't make us a state, we'll make ourselves a state, tell Congress we've already done it, and they'll say, okay. And so on January 15th, they hold a state constitutional convention. And on March 3rd, 1862, they have an election for a self-proclaimed shadow state of Deseret. Anybody want to guess who's elected governor? Brigham Young, and Heber C. Kimball is lieutenant governor. And so they consider it a state election, and for several months they run governments in parallel in the territory of Utah, until Congress finally has to come out and say, knock it off. It's not the way it works. Okay, let's give you another one. Here, also I will tell you, this Constitution that is published in the Deseret News, it's very much a product of the mid-19th century. They were going to limit General Assembly members to be free white males. I mean, it's very much a product of its time, okay? And this quote from the New York Times. Because what's happening is all around Utah, during the Civil War, Utah gets carved up a couple of times. We take off Nevada, we take off another piece, we keep getting carved up. Utah had, for years, petitioned every session of Congress for admission as a state in vain, while Oregon, with half the population, it becomes a state, okay? Why? Because they were poor damn Mormons, and that was sufficient. The national government was bad off, but they tied the hands of the people of Utah. So it was very frustrating to Utahns. They couldn't get statehood during this period. Well, let's give you a 5th thing that's maybe something new. Utah has been criticized in some publications in the last couple of years for not participating in the war. And so I was curious. I got checking on it, and what I found is that as a territory, and there were 7 territories at the time, as a territory, we are exactly average. And here's the numbers for you. Oregon is a state. Nevada is a state. And by the way, they make Nevada a state. Did you know this? Like 3 weeks before the election of 1864, because they knew it was going to vote Republican and go for Lincoln. Yeah, it's goofy politics didn't start with the current administration, okay? But Dakota, a territory, Utah, a territory, and Washington, a territory, all supply one military company. We are exactly the same as the other territories. When people have said we didn't participate, they're comparing us with California, which has multiples of our population and is a state and is a very wealthy state and does provide more units. But as territories go, Arizona doesn't even provide any, and I've never heard anybody beat up on Arizona because they didn't provide any units to the war. We do provide the Locksmith Cavalry Company, so just very briefly what happens. This is Holiday, and Ben Holiday owns the postal and shipping and stagecoach lines. He goes to the senator, a guy named Latham from California, and says, we need to protect the lines and I don't want to pay for it. Latham goes to his buddy Lincoln, who's in his party, because Latham's a Republican from California, and says, Mr. President, ask the Mormons to provide a company. Lincoln goes to Lorenzo Thomas, who's his adjutant general at the War Department, and says, make it happen. But send it to Brigham Young. They know the way the politics work in Utah. They're not going to send it to the acting governor. Send it to Brigham Young. So he telegrams Brigham Young on the 28th of April, 1862, and later that day, he writes at 9 o'clock at night, Daniel H. Wells, his first counselor in the first presidency, and the lieutenant general in charge of the Nauvoo Legion, or the Utah Militia. Okay? This is the letter that gets sent, but here's the fun part. This is what you may not know. When Brigham is dictating this letter at 9 o'clock at night, he's probably speaking like this, and he's in a great deal of pain. Because this guy, earlier that day, pulled the last 3 remaining teeth from Brigham Young's head. He only had 3 teeth left, and he lost all 3 on the 28th of April. And so he's in, this is without Novocaine or any, no painkillers. As he's dictating this letter, it's probably very, very painful for him to do so. And by the way, just as another aside, you know who makes his false teeth? It's the acting governor of the state, a guy named Fuller. And he'd rather be a dentist than the acting governor. He makes Brigham Young's teeth, just kind of a fun aside. And then Daniel H. Wells then goes to Lot Smith and says, we want you to come in this company. And by the way, is that not the coolest beard in the planet? And then the Lot Smith Cavalry Company serves, they're supposed to serve for 90 days. This is a very common Civil War type of service. They actually serve for a little over 100 days because they're too far out and can't get back in time. But they serve faithfully. But this is the part of the story that's not always told. James Doty, a former Indian superintendent of Utah, becomes the governor in 1864. He gets a letter from General Irvin McDowell. McDowell is commanding Department of the Pacific, which is headquartered in San Francisco. And McDowell says this. This is the letter that he sends. And McDowell says, I have received authority to raise, from the states and the territories, what I've got permission to do is to raise 4 more companies from Utah. And if the war had not ended when it did, Utah would have been asked to provide 4 more companies. And we would have led even several of the states, and would have 5 times the number of units that we did. So people wonder about what's going on with the military. The company that served from Utah did so well, they want 4 more. And it's followed up on the 10th of October, the next week, with forms to muster the people in, with cash allowances and all kinds of things. They're serious about doing this. But then what happens before they do it is they can see the South is going to fold, and there's no sense to bring them in. So let's give you another one here. And that is, even though the Lot Smith Cavalry guys only serve, for how much time have I got? Okay. Well, even though the Lot Smith Cavalry guys only serve for like 100 days, they qualify for military pensions. Okay? That's not big pensions. I've seen the pension records. Here's one of them. This is one for Joseph Felt. He's a platoon leader. He's a lieutenant. This is corporal here in captains, but he later gets commissioned. He writes a great letter, by the way. Washakie, if you know the Indian chief Washakie, he does a great letter on the 4th of July from Washakie. But anyway, that's another story for another day. But they get these pensions, and it's like for $1 or $1.50. But they're widows, and most of them don't claim it until they're gone. It's their spouses claim it. But just that little bit of service qualified them for pensions. I found that kind of fun. Next is Richard Atwood's situation. Richard Atwood is the first sergeant for Lot Smith in this company. And he writes later, he keeps one of the logs, by the way. What we know about the Lot Smith Cavalry Company comes from the first sergeant, Sergeant Atwood. But he writes to Patrick Edward Connor and basically says, look, Brigham's making threats against me. You got to help us out of Utah. This is a guy that had been the first sergeant. And then what happens is Patrick Edward Connor adds a note on the letter and says, this guy is a Josephite, meaning he's a member of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So following the Lot Smith Cavalry Company, he apparently went from being a Brighamite to a Josephite. And Connor says, they're okay. They're anti-polygamists, and they're cool. You don't have to worry about them. Well, there's lots of stories. How much time I got now? 2 minutes? Okay, 2 minutes. We'll talk fast. A flagpole almost leads to war. Brigham Young's flagpole. What happens is it's called March Madness by several authors. But we almost go to war here in Salt Lake in March of 1863. And the Army and Brigham are both about really close to start shooting. Part of it is over a flagpole, because there's a U.S. Army flagpole in the front of the Beehive House. It's a 40-foot flagpole. Connor thinks that Brigham Young has stolen it. What happens is, as the Army is leaving in 1861, Philip St. George Cook gives him the flagpole as a sign of respect from the Army. And Brigham Young is grateful for it, and acknowledging Philip St. George Cook's service to the Latter-day Saints, plants it in the front of the Beehive House. Connor, though, sees that flag, and reports come back to him that it's a U.S. Army flagpole, and he sees it as a sign of disrespect. And it's part of the thing that causes him to almost go to war. And so, yeah, it's just kind of, that's where the flagpole comes from. Well, I'll leave with this. Even after the war, Utah's remained loyal throughout the war, but after the war, Utah is still viewed as disloyal, and then we enter into the whole period with polygamy as they try to stamp out the second relic of barbarism. This is a newspaper article from November 1865. Listen to this text. It is my firm belief that in the spring of 1861, South Carolina was more loyal to the Union than Utah is today. Now think about that. In the spring of 1861, what had South Carolina done? Seceded and fired on Union forces and began the Civil War. But according to the writers of the New York Times, they're still more loyal than Utah. So yeah, it's just kind of a, Utah can't win no matter what they do. Well, I'll leave you with that. That's some things you may not have known about the Civil War, and I'll turn it over to Gene. Thanks.
I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but I did receive a request to do a little commentary. By the way, Ken, you forgot to mention that in their embarrassment, the Stewarts changed the name of their child from Philip St. George Cook.
That's telling me to sit down and shut up.
Well, that's right. I forget his name was Philip St. George Cook Stewart, and they changed his name to something else. They were so embarrassed of him. Let me just make a few comments. I do want to leave plenty of time for questions. As you know, Scott mentioned, he kindly shared with me a much larger version of his brief paper we heard today. And I cannot overstate my positive regard for that work. 47 pages manuscript, Scott. Exhaustively documented. In fact, as I was going through it, the biggest impression is, wow, this young man has really done an enormous amount of work and research. And it really a veritable compendium of everything extant that relates to the subject. It's really saying something. In addition to all this, his skills as a storyteller and a fine writer make his narrative riveting. So you owe me no apology for sending it, Scott. I enjoyed it immensely and learned a great deal from it. You heard his basic thesis that extralegal violence among the saints was related more to normal human motivations common to the West than to religious fanaticism. This will undoubtedly irritate folks like John Krakauer, but he makes his case very well, and with a modicum of caution that makes it even more difficult to discount. While there is nothing particularly novel about this claim, Mike Quinn similarly argued the case. Scott does it with such a massive body of evidence his work nevertheless breaks ground that still needs plowing. A good example is his recounting of the Parish Potter murders. He didn't mention that today, but even cautious Utah historians often characterize the most compelling example of the practice of blood atonement. Scott argues convincingly against the routine, you heard him do this, acceptance of blood atonement as a principal motive for extralegal violence in early Utah. Studying Scott's work brought to mind Yale's legendary Western historian Johnny Mack Farragher. Had a chance to spend a couple hours with Johnny Mack a few years back, came to Weber, and I was the department chair, and I had to take him back and forth to the airport. What a fascinating person he is if you've never had a chance to be with him. But he criticized the Walker Turley Leonard book on Mountain Meadows for failing to do what Scott has done with the examples of extralegal violence he chronicles. Farragher hammered the book for its author's failure to use it as a way to understand the commonality and perhaps inevitability of such horrific acts in the context of Western history in general. So he's in your camp, Scott. You might want to give him a call at Yale and see if he'll invite you to come back for your PhD. In 1854, J.D. Grant greeted a party of converts arriving from England with a cautionary advice to expect to find in Zion the best people in the world, and then by natural law also the worst. Scott mentioned that. In this light, maybe the common motivations for bad folks to commit nasty acts of violence elsewhere in the West resulted in arguably more mayhem in Utah because there really were more bad guys here. But I really think what Grant was trying to tell these newcomers is, they're like everybody else. You're going to find dirt bags. You're going to find wonderful people who are like everybody else, and that's good. That's the good and the bad. And I'm reminded of the old Southerner who was asked to explain the relatively high murder rate in New South cities compared to similar cities in the North. He scratched his head and then said, "Well, I reckon there are just more people in the South who need killing. Maybe in the Old West, including Utah, a similar situation existed." A couple of comments about Ken, and again, I'm moving quickly because I want you to have plenty of time for questions. My impression, far from just a collection of interesting and curious vignettes and anecdotes, Ken's paper adds significantly to the work he undertook with such success in his Civil War saints. And if you don't have that book, get it. It's an amazing thing, not just for genealogists, but full of such interesting information on the subject he discussed with us today. Dispelling the myth that Utah had little to do except sit on the sideline and wish success to both sides, quote unquote. It's almost whimsical title referencing things you may not know. It becomes apparent immediately that there is considerable significance to these bits of history. More than just, hey, I really didn't know that. The best part is learning more about what you may not have known so that you come to realize how important it is to comprehend more fully Utah's place in the greatest drama in American history. Having heard him speak on how the Eastern press viewed the Utah War, I was not surprised to learn first about how it treated the Territorial and its people during the Civil War. I was also not surprised at what Ken tells us about that treatment. I don't think historians of Utah and the Mormons deal with this subject nearly enough, and Latter-day Saints then and now cannot quite fathom the depth of distaste the rest of the nation had and have for them. We had the Mormon moment with Mitt Romney, and I think many of you saw how the press had difficulty all the way through that with the Mormon people. In this connection, I'm reminded of the work I did on Grant's painful excursion to Philadelphia and Washington in 1852 to admit to the world the practice of polygamy in Utah. He tried to defend his peculiar faith, the theocracy back home that had incited the runaway judges affair, and came home discouraged that he had had little effect on public opinion. You just couldn't change it, as we see from Ken's last remarks here. Ken is perhaps unequaled in his remarkable depth of understanding in this area and helps us grasp how really deep ran the animosity and hostility that the nation felt toward Utah and Mormonism. This is crucial in understanding the long period of the so-called raid that characterized the territory's troubled history following the war, including carpetbag occupation, the denial of statehood almost into the next century. The way the press regarded Mormonism carried perhaps more causal energy than even its portrayal in literature that Leonard Arrington outlined so well in his Intolerable Zion in 1968. Among other 8 categories Ken covers, I found most interesting his work on preparations during the war for a resurrected state of Deseret. And I think I take a little different view than Ken. We'll have to have an argument or arm wrestle over this later. But I have a suspicion that as things went badly for the North into 1862, people out here in Utah began to participate in the famous counterfactual hypothesis: what if the South had won the Civil War? I don't know, San Diego might have made a fine base for the Deseret Navy. I think maybe that might be possible. Equally interesting is the Richard Atwood story, especially how Patrick Edward Connor characterized him as a Josephite, so, quote, anti-polygamist and therefore loyal. Perhaps the least surprising of Ken's topics, the last one, relative to how negatively the country saw Utah after the war. During recent research I did on Utah and the Pacific Railroad, I was amazed, perhaps more than I should have been, with the constant drumbeat of anti-Mormon rhetoric all up and down the chain of actors in that incredible post-war drama. Perhaps most intriguing about the realization is how much visiting railroad people routinely admired what they saw in Utah while utterly despising those who had built it. With those brief remarks, I'd like you to hammer these guys now. Who's first? I'll just hand the mic to them and you raise your hand and they can call on you.
Question 4.
This is for Ken. Ken, there seems to be a little bit of ambiguity with reference to slavery and Brigham Young. It seems as if he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, this is tough. Utah becomes a territory on September 9th, 1850. Part of that act that makes California a state. As part of they're still trying to mollify the South at that point. So when California becomes clearly a free state, The way they balance the books is the territory created is slavery is permissible in the territories created. So Utah, the federal government dictates that this will be a slave territory, or at least slavery is legal here. You know, probably from the 1860 census, we have, 28 slaves, I think, primarily in Davis County. There's a great article in Utah Historical Quarterly, not a plug for the organization sponsoring this, but I'll say that's where it is, by Chad Orton from a couple of years ago, talking about this whole issue of slavery around the Civil War and Utah's relationship to it, as well as church leaders, as well as territorial leaders, which quite frankly are often the same people. And again, it's Chad Orton. I forget the year. I want to say it's about 2013. 2014, something like that, but I would refer you to that article. He's fully footnoted and hunted down all of that. He also addresses one of the things that Gene mentioned. There's been a continuing debate on secession views inside of Utah, and there have been several things written. In fact, one book that was published in 2015 claimed that up to 80% of Utahns were secessionists. In my research, I haven't found that. And when you check down the sources of those that have made that claim, there are clearly some pro-secessionist people here. We've got some folks that come from the South. Also, I think Jedediah Grant does missionary work in Virginia and Tazewell County, and several of those folks come into Utah, and I'm sure they're bringing secessionist views with them. But from my research, it's a really small minority. What happens, and this is just related, and then they have to take another question, but I just want to share one thing that didn't come out from the presentation. When the war starts, Brigham Young has a pretty neutral view. In fact, his first reference that we have of him to Abraham Lincoln, he calls him Abel Lincoln, A-B-E-L, as in Cain and Abel. And it's not a mistake. He's not goofing up his name. Because Utah had gone out so much in favor of Buchanan, and then Buchanan turns around and just slaps him with the Utah War and all the other problems, that Brigham Young apparently is very cautious and suspicious of Abraham Lincoln. It's a new political party, it's untested and those kind of things. But very quickly into the war, and you just see this at all levels, from individuals writing, family members back east, all the way up to the top leaders of the Latter-day Saint Church, is just deep sorrow for the nation as we just continue to go through this, and it just getting the body counts increase, and it just, by 1863, by the time we reach Gettysburg, the nation is heartsick, and Utah is heartsick as well. And you can just kind of see that turn from the earliest days. I should probably say next question.
I just had one thing. You mentioned that Brigham Young, was saddened by the Civil War. Was the prophecy that was given that the Civil War would start in South Carolina, was that well known at that time, or was it not?
Yeah, the question was how well known was what Latter-day Saints today refer to as Section 87, the revelation on the Civil War. That is not part of the Latter-day Saint Doctrine and Covenants at that time. The Doctrine and Covenants is being used in 1861 when the war breaks out as the 1844 edition. It's not included in that edition. It is added by Orson Pratt in 1876, but it's a well-known revelation. And it's carried in pockets by missionaries, especially as they go throughout the East, and they carry handwritten copies of it. My favorite is, in fact, there's an article I would refer you to. It's one of the chapters in Civil War Saints that we did in 2012 is by Scott Esplin, and he addresses this question. He looks at Joseph Smith's revelation and how it was used by both sides. Many newspapers, surprisingly, actually printed the revelation at the beginning of the Civil War in full. A Philadelphia newspaper, and I've lost the name, I think it's Philadelphia Inquirer, in May of 1861, prints the entire revelation and titles it, the headline of the article is, "Have we not had a prophet among us?" And then it quotes all of what Latter-day Saints consider as Section 87. So it does receive some press. It's not universally printed. Every newspaper doesn't pick it up, but we found several instances. Again, Scott's essay, and you can find a copy of that at rsc.byu.edu. There's a free copy. You can just go up and download it. He addresses it well, or buy the out-of-print book. But it's a really interesting question. And a lot of Latter-day Saints at the beginning of the war see this as payback for the killing of Joseph and Hiram.
Oh, yeah.
When the war starts. I mean, that feeling is not. What's also common, John Taylor makes a statement. He says, we, Latter-day Saints, know no east, no west, no north, no south. He says they were trying to stay out of it, but as the war continues, there's no staying out of it. It's fly paper. Next question.
For
How in the world did that name change come to life? Of the guy who didn't even tell his wife.
Okay, can I send you to an article that I did in Mormon Historical Studies? In Mormon Historical Studies, I want to say it's 2016 or 2017. If you send me an email, I could send you a copy. And it may even be up on Scholars Archive at BYU. But it's very common. The bottom line is it's very common. There are thousands of these guys. And you can see, back then, there's no social security number. There's no computerized records. You want to change your name? Ta-da! Wake up, move to a different city. You're now Irving Schmuckelheimer. And nobody knows the difference. So he does this. Interestingly, we have a record. I found a record in the Deseret News. I poured through all of the records, and I think I have found his arrival in Utah, because I found a John E. Davis that arrives right after he defects, basically, when he leaves. Because he's still a Southerner at heart, and his whole life he talks about his Southern military service. He never tells any of his children about being a Yankee. He's just so embarrassed. He joins the what's called the volunteer units, and they're all made up of galvanized Yankees.
another question. We got a few minutes. Yes.
Question for Scott. Would you agree with this Yale professor's criticism of the Mountain Meadows Massacre book? Or I'm wondering if in the longer version of the paper you address the massacre and what you say about it.
Yeah, I actually reviewed the same book, but in a different publication. It was my take on it. No, I don't share. I think their work, but I do share what Professor Sessions, kind of the conclusion that they need to be viewed in their humanity, that they're normal people. Because as Brigham said and many others, like the double standard, so you go and you hang someone. Well, if you're a Latter-day Saint, you go and hang someone, you're a religious fanatic. But as what I saw pouring through the archives at Berkeley and Utah and a couple different places was all these different incidents, and in the secondary sources too, a lot of times it's so easy to attach it to blood atonement that's the depth that a lot of people were going to. They wouldn't go a little deeper. And when you do go a little deeper, it gets too hard to really pin it one way or the other. But going back to the Mountain Meadows point, I see Mountain Meadows as it was a horrible thing that happened, but I see it more as an exception that proves the rule about the Latter-day Saints in the West. And so that's the part that I didn't talk at length in here, but I try and go into more in the fuller paper. So I hope that helps.
I might just add that Farragher's point, I don't know if I described, I was trying to read my material too quickly. His point was, he praised the book, and then he said, what we need to understand more, though, is that it might well have happened in other places. Because I'll get it to you, it was on a panel that he sat on, that the same forces that we can identify leading to Mountain Meadows could have been elsewhere.
In that case, yes, I would agree.
Yeah, I didn't characterize my paraphrasing of Farragher very well. Other questions for our panelists? I won't answer any if you ask me. Yes?
I wonder if you could just comment in the Brigham and Bagley book of Mormon Rebellion, and they are mentioning about in the context of the governor coming and of a duck hunt. Can you verify if this is anything true when he says that there was violence?
For a duck hunt?
Yes, this phrase that it was used in context.
The governor was the duck?
Leaders against leaders.
Sorry, so it was so I'm not remembering that instance. So it was
so Bigley and Bagley.
Yeah. Bigler and Bagley, yeah. Will Bagley and David Bigler.
They mentioned that the phrase that the local leaders used as far as the federal leaders who came in, because you also mentioned how it was kind of carpetbagger government, that they used this phrase, take them out on a duck meant they take him and kill him, and that Cumming knew of that and was afraid. Do you have anything you came across that verifies what they're saying?
No, but I do know, I mean, as was pointed out too by Ken, is that the relationship between the United States government and the Latter-day Saints was horrible. Like, they didn't trust each other at all. Now, as far as like taking leaders out and killing them, like meaning the ones who were sent, I don't remember off the top of my head a lot of those instances of where the leaders were killed, but I do know of a lot of instances where certain leaders in Utah that went out, like the Aiken Party and others, there was things going on that were suspicious. But like I said, one of the problems is when you didn't know the answer, back then and now, you didn't have to think much about it. You just blame blood atonement. Like, and I think like Polly Aird's done an amazing job, and Artist Partial and others in showing that like there's a lot of nuance to these incidents that we think are really simple. And when you really start to tear down into the detail, you see, okay, now would I say that saying wasn't common? No, I probably was. They were always threatening each other all the time. But as far as like taking those steps, that's a little bit more rare, at least from what I saw.
I would agree, but I'm not on the panel. Ken?
We consider you on the panel, Gene. Just a quick little bit of trivia. It's not really directly addressing it, but after Dawson, do you know who they sent out to Utah? It's a guy named Stephen C. Harding. And Harding comes out as a territorial governor picked by Lincoln. And Harding has a unique claim of connection to the church. I don't know if you know this or not. Harding is from the Palmyra area. And Harding said that he saw the original galley sheets of the Book of Mormon when it was being published. And so that's the way he kind of introduces himself to the church. Now, things very quickly go south. Because Harding is the governor when they have the March Madness and almost go to war. And part of why they almost go to war is they're trying to get rid of the governor and 2 federal judges. But Harding starts out in this real honeymoon because he says, yeah, I was there, I knew Joseph, and I saw the Book of Mormon laid out at Grandin's Press, and just kind of an interesting aside of all the people in the United States. Palmyra is not a big place ever, not now or then, and Lincoln picked somebody from there. Just kind of a piece of trivia for you.
One of my responsibilities is to make sure this ends on time. We have 2 minutes.
When you were talking about Danites, I have relatives. Reminded me that I have relatives that say that the KKK in Riverton was pretty much a Danite sort of group. Have you looked into the KKK at all?
What was the last part?
They're very much similar, akin to the Danites.
Were they akin to the Danites? That's a loaded question. Gene?
Actually, I'll pass the buck to Larry Gerlach, who has worked on the Klan in Utah. And my impression from listening to Larry and reading his stuff is that might not be his opinion, but I can't speak for him. I had not heard that. It's very interesting. We're out of time. Thank you so much. We have another round of applause for our presenters.